Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Yimhen. I'm really excited to moderate today's book club. Our special guest is Zeyn Joukhadar, who is the author of the novels The Map of Salt and Stars, which came out by Touchstone and Simon & Schuster in 2018, and The 30 Names of Night, Atria and Simon & Schuster in 2020, which we'll be talking about today. Zeyn is a member of the Radius of Arab-American Writers, Arawi, which if you don't know, you should know. They're doing amazing. They are amazing. His work has appeared in Kink Stories, Salon, the Paris Review, Shondaland, Pank, Mizna, and elsewhere, and has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and Best of the Net. Zeyn, welcome to afikra. You have been on this list for a long time. We're excited to have you here. It's really exciting.
Thanks so much, Mickey. I'm really psyched to be here.
So I guess the first couple questions, we were talking briefly before the call started about where you are now. And you mentioned you're in Italy right now, but I'm curious where you did most of your writing for this book. And I guess where did you grow up?
Uh, well, let's see. So, I mean, I'm originally from New York City. And I have family like outside of the New York City area, and so I'm pretty frequently there as well. And I mostly wrote this book when I was to be honest, when I was in a period of sort of, let's say I was not stably housed, and so I was moving around a lot. Part of the time I was living in Brooklyn, as well as Queens for a short stint. But yeah, so I'm pretty
Yeah,
frequently back in that area, and I mean, since it's where I grew up, it's an important place to me, and a lot of the book is also takes
yeah.
place in that city.
I was wondering because it's a book about New York in many ways, right? And sort of revealing what New York is and was and might be. It's funny as I was reading the afikra, afikra's mission statement about sort of reimagining what this place is and was and might be in the future. I was like this is precisely what this book is about. Um, but I was wondering what your relationship to New York is right now. Do you have sort of an adversarial relationship to the city?
I wouldn't say it's adversarial. I mean, I think I have a complicated relationship with the city. I think the city has changed a lot since I grew up there.
Sure.
I mean, my family left the city like in the sort of mid to late 90s when there was like a big wave of gentrification happening in our neighborhood. We lived in what was at the time a mostly immigrant neighborhood just south of Harlem, on the east side, and now it's completely different, totally gentrified. It looks nothing. It's like unrecognizable to me when I walk around there, and it's really weird. And so as I was writing this book, I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about the neighborhood of Little Syria, but also about the neighborhood where I grew up, and just the ways that there's not just one city, but like many cities layered on top of each other. So I try not to have any like animosity for the city that is missing. But at the same time to sort of like, build with what you have, right? Like to forge a new connection with the places and people that are there now.
Yeah. As you've traveled around the world, do you feel like um, that is a uniquely New York, um, like a unique something that's unique to New York, or when you're in a place, I don't know what city you are in Italy, or if you're in Chicago or London or Montreal or New Orleans or Bogota, do you feel like, yeah, there are all these like hidden stories layered on top of each other? There's constant erasure, there's constant um, rewriting of history. Do you feel that's true everywhere?
I think it's true of a lot of places, at least. I mean, I definitely, I've spent some time in Milan, and it's definitely, I have friends that have told me like, oh, Milan has changed so much. It's not like it used to be. I mean, and even just like for an obvious example, I mean, I spent a short amount of time, but a little period living in Beirut, and I remember just the weight of like the history that you feel in certain places, is like it can feel heavy and it can also feel exciting. I mean, I think it depends on how you look at it, you know? So New York
Yeah.
is kind of the same way for me. It's like there is a lot of history that we could look at it as being erased, and in some ways, in many ways, it is some histories anyway. But
Yeah.
also, it's like, are things really erased, or is it that we just need to know how to look for them or how to read them? You know?
Yeah, I feel that way about Hamida. Like, so I live in a neighborhood in Beirut called Hamida, which
Hmm.
is
That's where I
um,
lived.
okay, great. So for people listening who've never been, it's sort of flanked by a bunch of different universities, kind of like the Lower East Side, a little bit like the sort of Greenwich Village in New York, where tons of students and tons of economic diversity and political diversity, lots of different types of folks there. But typically, I always sort of chuckle when people say, "Oh, Hamina is changing," or "it changed." And for me, it's like it's never not changed.
Right.
It's constantly changing, and the minute it stops changing is like a troubling sign. Okay, so sorry for a quick aside. Okay, so my question is with your first book, was experience of writing your first book versus your second book, the actual process of writing it, really different?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the process of writing every book is really different. Somebody once told me, I wish I could remember now who it was, but someone told me a while ago that you don't ever really learn how to write a book. You just learn how to write the book you're working on now. And I think that's true. I wish it wasn't true, but I think it's true because I kind of, as I set out to write the 30 Names of Night, or at least the draft that would eventually become 30 Names of Night, I tried to follow like the same sort of process that I followed with the first one, and it didn't work. Uh, I didn't.
What was that process?
You know, I tried to sort of outline everything before I started writing. I wanted to write sort of a quick and dirty draft, really fast, like less than a month, and then revise it like many times. And I mean, I do tend to revise a lot, like a lot of different drafts. And I tend to try to not be too precious about the words because I know that in any given draft, especially the first draft, I'm probably going to throw away like the vast majority of what I've written. It's just for me to get it down. And then I kind of understand, okay, I like this part of the story or this part of the story or this part, and then I just rewrite it again. And I just keep doing that. Each time I keep more and throw away less. But I do throw away on every draft, sometimes a really significant portion of what I've written. And I did do that with the 30 Names of Night, but it was a really different kind of animal, let's say. And I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't able to outline it in the same way that I did the first one. I think because it's not quite as plotty of a novel, you could say, which is not
Yeah.
a term that I love, but it's a much more it's I wouldn't consider it a quiet book per se because there's a lot. I mean, there's war. It spans like 100 years. It's like a huge undertaking in so many ways, and yet the feeling of the book is very. Each scene is just very sort of precise, and
Mm.
the tension is just in a different place emotionally. And so I couldn't quite. I didn't have that like strong line that Map of Salt and Stars has. This very, if you've never read it, it has a lot of physical movement. There's a family that's actually actively crossing borders, and the second storyline is crossing the same borders. And so there's this sense of like I knew where I was going, even if I had to figure out, move pieces of what was happening. With the
Yeah.
30 Names of Night, there's not as much physical movement. It's much more grounded in place, which I liked because, as we were talking about before, it is really grounded in New York City in these two different times, in the 1930s and 40s, and then the present day. But because it was so grounded, it also felt like where am I going? I had to like work to make it move. So it was just a really different book to write.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm really curious about the drafting process. You said like you could delete a bunch of stuff. You keep on going until you delete, I guess, less and less and less and less and less. But are you deleting just prose? You don't like the words on the paper, or are you deleting entire ideas, entire storyline, sections of story where like, oh, that was a mistake?
Usually, well, so the earlier drafts, it'll be more the second thing. It'll be more
Yeah.
deleting whole. I mean, I can delete whole plot lines, whole characters. I'll just be like, no, I don't like that sort of, side street that I took. Find my way back to the wrong turn that I took.
Yeah.
Um, and then
Can I ask
later
a stupid
on,
question
go for
before you
it. Go
keep on
for it.
going? Are you just doing this in like Google Docs?
No, no, I use Scrivener.
Okay, sorry. Just as somebody who's never even thought about writing a novel, I'm like, where do you even do this?
Yeah, no, it's a good question because I mean, for a lot of previous projects, I was just sort of, in Word document or whatever.
Yeah.
But I really like Scrivener actually because it allows me to, well, actually, one thing that I really like, and this is super nerdy, but I like to, there's an option in Scrivener when you sort of decide that you're going to begin a new revision, which for me, it's like, where does one revision end and the next begin? It's not always clear. But if I try to say like, well, I've gotten to the end, and so let me start over, and I can see at least what I've put in or taken out, and you can put the text in a different color in Scrivener, and so you can see like what I really like is just as a reminder when when I'm starting a new book, I go back and I'm like, okay, remember, if you look at all the colors of like, the red draft, the green draft, whatever, like almost nothing will be from the first draft. And it helps me emotionally to be like, it's okay if it sucks because I can go back and revise it to make it good. And it helps.
Oh, that makes me so happy. I have a buddy who's trying to write a novel, and my advice to him, as somebody who's never written a novel, is please go out and write a shitty book. And like
You
just
have to
write.
start somewhere,
Yeah.
you know?
Okay, sorry. Let's go back to you. So you used to cut out story, then you're on like version 35, and then you're cutting out at that point just like prose and things that you don't think is as tight.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends on, again, like it takes as many drafts as it takes, right?
Yeah.
So it's like I try to, that's the reason why I try not to get too attached to any of the prose at first, is because I'll just throw things at it until I understand where I want things and understand that there's, the character arcs are sort of doing what they're supposed to do, and the plot is, has enough tension, and there's no sort of what we call sagging middle, and the ending is okay, and whatever. And then I'll worry about the prose itself and trying to make it, polished or beautiful or whatever. But before that, I try, it's very hard, but I try not to worry too much about how I'm saying things and more just like, let me be clear and make sure that I'm saying what I actually want to say.
So we have this thing on the screen saying, "What were you doing before writing this book?" For those who can't see the screen, and obviously, at some point, you were writing the Map of Salt and Stars. But what were you doing immediately before deciding I want to write a book, and this is draft one of it?
Well, immediately before I wrote the Map of Salt and Stars,
No,
because I've
no,
been
no,
writing
no,
novels for,
no. Immediately before 30 names.
oh, before 30 names.
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, I wrote the first draft of 30 names before I think Map had just been picked up, if I'm not mistaken. It had just been acquired by a publisher. And I had maybe I was out on submission. It was around that time. And and I did this thing that I often recommend to my students who go on submission, which is you have got to write something else as soon as possible, because if not, you will just obsess over waiting to hear back, and it's like very bad for your self-esteem when the rejections come in.
Yeah.
So I had this thought like, I want to write about this neighborhood of Little Syria. I'm really interested in the history there, and and I want to write about the ways that like the past makes incursions on the present, so to speak, like the ways that the past interrupts the present and things like that. And a story also about immigration and about different, I guess, different segments of Arab America, you could say, in the sense that like my dad came to the States from Syria in like the late 60s. And so I'm, relatively speaking, like I don't come from an Arab American family that's been in America for like generations and generations, but there are some people like that. And I was
Yeah.
interested in like, how are we different? How are we alike? So I was just thinking about that and trying to distract myself from being on submission, to be honest.
Is it an intellectual exercise, or is it a sort of a practical exercise? Like you have like friends or people in your life who you're like, oh, interesting. Both of us seem to have this connection to this part of the world, but our experiences are entirely different. Why is that?
I think it's in some way, sure, it's a way to understand people that I know. It's a way also to understand, like, I mean, I wanted to understand why certain people believed certain things. I wanted to understand. There were a lot of questions I had, to be honest, about like assimilation. There were questions I had about um, different attitudes that I was seeing from different Arab people that I knew in not just in New York, but sort of that I had met, friends, family of friends, colleagues, and things like that. That people had very different attitudes toward whiteness, toward America itself, toward history, um, toward what they believed that they were supposed to be and what they believed I was supposed to be as a result. And I was just curious. Like I was like, I want to know why there are so many different ways of looking at us as a community, or why people look at us as a community when we're actually more splintered, I think, than we might want to believe. And and like, where does that leave me? Like, where do I, not just where do I fit, because I'm not sure that like fitting in or like belonging is sort of an exercise that I've maybe given up on in some way, at least along like identitarian terms.
Hmm.
But I wanted to get curious about like, what do we believe about ourselves and why?
Yeah. Amazing. So, while this is the structure of the series is supposed to be that everyone's read the book beforehand, I'm going to read just a brief, sort of the back cover essentially, to
Sure.
give people a sense of what this book is. In the 30 Names of Night, a closeted Syrian-American trans boy sheds his birth name and searches for a new one 5 years after the death of his mother. He's been unable to paint since his mother's ghost began to visit him each evening. As his grandmother's sole caretaker, he spends his days cooped up in their apartment, avoiding his neighborhood masjid, his estranged sister, and even his best friend. The only time truly feels free, is when he slips out at night and to paint murals on buildings in the once thriving Manhattan neighborhood known as Little Syria. It keeps on going, but I'll stop there for a second. I'm curious about names. And usually I never know how to launch a project really until I feel like I know the name of that project. How soon into writing did the 30 Names of Night come to you?
Pretty late, actually, to be honest. A lot of people don't know this about novels, but you don't have complete control over the title of a
Yeah.
novel. And so what happened with both of my books actually is that my editor had, really it's not the editor, it's like the marketing team usually is like, we're not 100% sure that this name is going to work. Can you give us some alternatives? Which is a nice way of saying we veto your title.
Yeah.
So originally this book had a different title, and then I sort of brainstormed a whole bunch of names, and this was the best one, because it tied in with one of the sort of main thematic threads, which was the Conference of the Birds and the 30 birds that like go in search of the divine, right? Which is like a big thread that symbolizes the character's search for the divine even in his own body as a trans person. But yeah, it was interesting because like before I had this the original name was taken from like a poem that it didn't even end up the poem didn't even end up in like as an epigraph or anything in the novel. It's just sort of like it was about searching for the divine, but I was like in the end it's sort of like I had written the entire thing and I was like multiple drafts in, and I was like, I don't need this anymore actually. Like it's funny how it came around to being like, you know what? Like, I agree. This is a much better title. So
So
it worked
what
out.
what was the moniker that you used for the writing of this when you're like, oh, I got to work on 30 names? What did you actually say? Oh, I got to work on what?
Uh,
how did you refer to it as in your head? Like,
I'm trying to remember.
I gotta work on the Layla Z story, or is this
Um,
like the Little Syria book, or what was it
I
called in your
think
head?
I think I was calling it the Little Syria book for a while in my head. I don't think I really ever thought about that. It was just like I got to work on the book because it was like, but maybe
Yeah,
maybe that actually. I try not to get too attached to my titles now because I know I'm like it's probably going to change, like I have to let it
yeah.
go.
Okay, so I want to start with I'll tell you what I want to start with. I want to start with the this where is the opening line?
Ooh,
Yeah, here we
quotes.
go. Um, I want to start with the opening line. Draft what featured this line, you think? Draft number 31, like 1 or 21. So the opening line is tonight, 5 years to the day since I lost you, 48 white-throated sparrows fall from the sky. Um, yeah. How long until you got that line? Because I mean, that frames the entire novel.
I tell you what, I'm gonna contradict everything that I said before. This was the first draft. This opening was in the first draft, and
Damn
it's
it,
because
Zane. You're a chorus of aspiring novelists are beating themselves.
no, no. Okay, well, so like the rest of the paragraph, I mean, the image. So one, okay, so the first line, aside from the fact that the timeline was a little different, it was longer originally. It was 10 years, and my editor, rightly so, was like, "Why 10 years?" And I was like, "Good point." But that line was there. The rest of the paragraph was a little bit different, but the image was the same, and it's because the image that I like it was the and it's funny because like in my first book the entire opening was written like the first half of the chapter I think was not written until draft like 8 or something, right? But like this one, like the opening scene and the opening image of the birds that are falling out of the sky because they're blinded by the lights of the city, um and the character that is like spoiler alert, I mean you find out pretty quickly, but like before the end of the chapter it's implied that this person is considering suicide, right? And is like struggling with a lot.
Yeah.
But that image of like being stopped by something unexplainable and being like, oh wow, I'm like actually really anchored to this world, that was the image I had in mind from the inception of the novel. That was the image that came to me first. And
Mm.
so that's why that line appeared there. And again, like sometimes some books, the image that comes to you is like way in the middle, and sometimes it's in the beginning. So I got lucky with that one, I guess.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful image, and I understand why it was strong enough to survive the drafting process and why it sort of anchors the entire book.
Thank you.
Okay, so here's a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it. Um, do you care about birds? I mean, did you care about birds before writing this book? Is that something that you cared about beforehand and thought, oh, this is I like birds, period? Or was it like, oh, this is a really useful metaphor?
No, no, I mean, it's a little like embarrassing, but actually, yes, I feel a really strong connection with birds. Am I going to say this and something's going to appear on YouTube? I have this reputation among my friends and family for like imitating birds really, really well. I won't do it here. I will spare you.
Oh, oh, Zane. Oh,
But it's so yeah, so I have actually been interested in birds for a really long time, and in bird art too. Like it's kind of a weird, maybe not that weird, but like a very oddly specific sort of interest slash hobby of mine.
sure.
I used to live in Massachusetts, and there was like a bird art museum that I would go to, and I actually drew a lot of birds while I was writing this book because one of the main characters,
Yeah.
is a bird artist. And so there was like, oh gosh, I don't have it here to show you, but we did like a promotional poster for the book, with the marketing team. And I told them, I was like, because they're like, do you have anything, they usually ask, right? Do you have anything to like share that could be helpful for us? I'm like, well, I draw birds, like, but like scientific illustration style, which I did for a while. I did do scientific illustration. That's a long story. And so they're like,
Really?
yeah, they're like, can you draw us a bird for like a poster that we can give out? And I was like, sure. So we did that. It was kind of fun.
Does that exist online and I just somehow it's escaped me?
It does, yeah. It's like around on Instagram, and there were like book bloggers that posted it. It's on mine somewhere too, but
Jeez, how did
it's
I miss that? Okay. I'm kicking myself. Um,
fine.
okay, so let's talk about Manhattan. We already sort of talked about it, but I want to talk a little bit about how much you knew about Little Syria growing up.
Growing up, I didn't know about it at all.
Yeah,
And
it's so funny. So few people do.
yeah, I mean, I think that's wild because I don't know. I mean, it's like I wasn't far away. Like, why didn't we know or talk about that? But I mean, it's also not the kind of thing that like I ever learned about in school. And it obviously there's like questions around like whose history is seen as being worth preserving. I mean, the Little Syria, I think it's called the Washington Street
Street
Historical
Society,
Society
yeah, yeah.
has been doing a lot of work to like try to preserve the historic buildings that are left, and they've had a really long struggle. Like it's been hard. I mean, I've been kind of watching that, and I don't know. It's a little bit sad to me.
Yeah. There's this passage. So I have up on the screen one of the quotes. Manhattan is an invisible city, a city that only lives in memories of those who were there. Um, but the quote I actually want to show you is the scene where you start to describe that neighborhood, which for those who don't know, Little Syria is basically right where the Wall Street, right off Wall Street, right next to the World Trade Center, essentially. Um, and you describe this church. I'm curious about the research that you had to do to, fully engross yourself in that time period. How what sort of responsibility did you feel like you had to kind of get the facts straight?
I did a lot of research for like a couple of years. I was actually a resident, an artist in residency, you could say writer in residence at the Arab-American National Museum,
Yeah,
and I was in their archives, and they have like one of the things that was really cool was their oral history archives,
with
which I
Matt
spent a long
Stifler.
time. I'm sorry.
With Matt Stifler.
Yeah. um, and so I was looking through photos, oral histories, newspapers in Arabic and in English, and it was like a lot, which was great, right? Because it's a trove. I mean, it's a treasure trove of information, and it was a little overwhelming, and I had to kind of, I think there's always this sort of balance that you do with books where there's like where there needs to be heavy amounts of research because you have to do enough research to inform the world that you're building, especially if the history is recent. Like in my first book, I was researching things that happened 800 years ago, and I was like, well, okay, if I take a little more poetic license with some of this, and anyway, it was part of a fable, it was like I felt more okay. I still got criticism, for certain things, but I did my best, right? With
Yeah.
this, I was like, look, there are people that, are still like, and I talked to some people actually who lived in Little Syria before the majority of it was demolished. And I did like interviews and things like this. And I wanted, like, I did feel that I had a responsibility to try my best at least to like when I was painting the world to be like, okay, I mean the characters can be fictional. I mean they're all fictional, but I still want it to feel like if somebody picked up the book, I want them to feel like they could settle into it a little bit. I don't want them to feel like I don't know, like it's lost in some way, even to someone who's ostensibly researching it. Like I want them to feel like, okay, something remains, if that makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense. So I guess, how do you mentioned criticism? How do you feel about the people who criticize your books now? That's one. And how do you feel about people who sort of don't criticize it, but kind of misunderstand it and deeply misunderstand what the book is trying to say?
Well, I mean, like once you put anything out there, it's open to criticism,
Yeah.
and you just have to kind of, as a writer, I think you just sort of accept that, and you're just like, it's okay. Like, the book doesn't belong to me anymore, right? Like the book belongs to the readers,
Yeah.
um,
But how does it
and
feel?
Well, I mean, it depends, right? It depends
Yeah,
on what kind of criticism it is.
sure.
I think most of the time, most of the time, what because I remember you had mentioned you wanted to talk about like people that misunderstand your work, and I had been thinking about this question, and I think that like sometimes you can feel sort of sad maybe that things get missed, like that you're like, oh, but like, oh, they didn't see that thing. Like, oh, well, okay, that's fine. I mean, like maybe it wasn't for that person, or like people. I mean, people are going to take what they need to take from your work or what they want to
Yeah.
take from your work, and like ultimately. I mean, you can write a really nuanced, well-researched thing, and like some people are going to really appreciate it and get it, and like some people just won't get it, and that's okay. I mean,
Yeah.
you have to be okay with that if you're going to write.
Do people sort of superimpose this as being semi-autobiographical on you, and you're like, no, this is a novel?
I mean, people superimpose, and I think this is really common for anybody who is not like a white cis straight writer, right?
Yeah.
Like people assumed my first book was autobiographical too. Definitely with this one. And I think that like the thing that gets to me about that is not so much that it's just sort of like no, it's not autobiographical at
Yeah.
all, but also like it's I think unfortunately it can often be a way of like minimizing the amount of craft that goes into a work like this,
Yeah.
where sometimes it's just a misunderstanding, and sometimes it's more like, oh well, you just sort of took a story that was there and you wrote it down, and there's not this
Like
like
you handed in
huge
your
amount of
middle
work.
school like diary.
Yeah. So that can be frustrating. But also, it is very true that people will sort of see what they want to see in it. It was a little bit frustrating when the reviews of the book came in and people were like, this is about a trans man. And I was like, well, actually, I mean, it says pretty, in the text, there's nothing about manhood, being a trans man, or any of that. There's also no actual label that the character puts on
Hmm.
his gender. He uses he, him pronouns. But I mean, I use he, him pronouns too, and I identify as non binary. And I would describe the character as non binary. In fact, there's some pretty, clear writing where the narrator says like something about not identifying with a binary gender. Um, you
Yeah.
know, but I think it's funny that people sort of needed to label it in that way, where it was sort of like, well, this is a character who's actually really upset by that kind of
Yeah.
binary labeling, So I don't know. That's I could go on.
Do you feel like you have to protect Nadir?
Um, I don't think that I have to protect Nader because I think that he like most of the book is about him sort of learning to protect himself, but
Yeah.
I do feel that it sort of belies some deeper cultural things where it's
Sure.
like even if it's just things like, oh, you use this pronoun and therefore this that you must identify with this particular gender, or if you describe yourself as non-binary you must use this pronoun, and it's sort of like I don't know. You wish for a little bit of chill sometimes and just be like, just read the text. Just sit with
Yeah.
the text. Like it's okay, because it's more like I don't want I don't know, because that's like people put that not just on the character but on me and on like a lot of people that I love. So that's frustrating, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, so I have more questions. How do you sit with a book like this after it's done, right? So it's done. It's um, by some metrics, maybe not every single metric that you keep track of, but from my perspective, it's a huge success. I hope you also feel like it's a huge success. Um, how do you feel about a book like this now? I mean, I have like text up on the screen. Are you kind of cringing looking at it? Are you still looking at things that you wish were different? Or do you feel really good about it and you just like have a healthy relationship with it and have moved on?
I mean, I actually really love this particular passage. I feel cool with it. Like, I think you reach a point, like there are things that I would, for example, like there's things that I would go back and change about my first book now.
Mhm.
But like, I think you sort of reach a point where you're like, you know what? Like, I've put something out into the world. It no longer belongs to me. I have grown and changed as a writer and as a person. And like, if I wouldn't write a thing now the way I wrote it then, maybe that's a good thing. Like maybe that means that I've grown. In fact, if that's what it means, then I want to feel that. I want to
Yeah.
always feel like I'm getting better and growing as a person, and also seeing things differently, so that I would write something in a different way. Because otherwise, like if I'm like, oh yeah, everything that I ever wrote is like perfect, and I wouldn't do anything differently, like what does that say about where I'm at, you know?
Sure. Sure. Um, I have two more questions before we move on to the quick Q&A. So anyone online who has questions, please type them in now so we can make sure to get to them. So the two questions, the first is, whose work do you see sort of like referenced in here that maybe I'm not picking up on? Like what other author's DNA is very clearly in here that may not be obvious?
Hmm, that's a good question. I mean, like on the one hand, I could answer that by being like everything I've ever written, everything
Sure.
I've ever read, right, is in what I've written. Um, and I think that I mean, and some writers are just like my friends whose work I really admire. Like one of them is Randa Jarrar.
Yeah.
Um, Rabi Alameddin is another writer who, like, in a way, I mean, not like I actually teaching me, but just by reading his work, like he taught me how to write certain kinds of things. Um, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot. And I could like give you a huge long list, but really, I guess I'll just say that like every writer that I've ever read has taught me something, and then also like in a very particular way, reading other queer Arab writers, other queer Swana writers, um, like told me what was possible in a way that if I hadn't seen it done first, if I would just have been like, and I had this thought when I read a lot of things where it was like, oh my God, you can do that, you know?
Hmm. Does do you feel like that? Do you feel like you're doing that right now, or do you kind of shudder at that thought?
What do you mean
Do you
exactly?
feel like you're doing that for other writers, looking at your work,
Oh
saying, "Oh my
gosh.
God, can you do that? You can do that?"
I
Question
hope
mark.
so. That would be the huge, I mean, that would be a huge compliment if somebody told me that. Like, I would be super touched if someone was like, you know what, I read your work and I was like, oh, I didn't realize that we could do that. Like, that to me is like the ultimate. Because that's when I see somebody doing something in their work where I look at it and go, oh, damn, like, you broke the rule book that I had. Like, that's where I'm really learning something, you know?
Mm, awesome. Okay. My last question before we move on is, what are you working on now?
I am working on a number of different novels. I have some short stories coming out in some anthologies that I'm putting aside to work on the novels. I'm working on an adult novel, and I'm also working on a young adult sci-fi novel with a largely trans cast that I'm really psyched about. Um, and I also just had, on a completely different note, I just had an art show open in Corsica that I collaborated on with my partner. It's a solo show at the FRAC, which is the main museum in Corsica.
Cool.
And yeah, it's kind of cool to like collaborate with visual artists. My partner's a visual artist, and so we had this cool like sort of collaborating with like the visual and with the written word. It's mostly the show mostly actually is about like let's say like trans-Mediterranean stories and traditions of the night sky. And it grew out of research I actually did for my first book. So it's cool to
Mm.
see it show up in like a more interdisciplinary way.
How can people find that?
So I've been posting a lot about the show on my Instagram,
Okay.
videos and pictures and things. There's also some stuff on the FRAC website and social media and stuff like that. But probably my Instagram is the best place to go.
Okay. I actually lied. I have another question for you. Um, which storyline you felt came more easily to you, the sort of historical storyline, or the contemporary one? And who did you like sitting
Ooh.
with more? Did you like sitting with Layla more than Nadir, or like who did you actually like enjoy spending time with?
I mean, I would say I enjoyed, it's like choosing between your children in a way. It's like, oh, I enjoyed both of the storylines, but I would say that the historical was easier to write for me. Um, Mostly because I think the person was just much more different from me. Like the more similar a character is to me, and it doesn't, and which doesn't again like mean they have to be autobiographical.
Yeah,
But like
sure.
when somebody is, weirdly similar, you do as a writer, you have to do extra work to differentiate them. Like especially when it's in first person, like you really
Mm.
have to do certain kinds of distancing sort of exercises and things to be like, okay, I have to not get swallowed by this story too, you know?
Is that for the reader's sake or for your own sake, so that there's a fidelity, the character has a fidelity to the truth?
It's both. It's for because the thing that happens is that you at least okay, this is for me. I find it very hard to do the necessary work of betraying your characters if I get sort of swallowed by them and I feel too close to them. Especially when it's in first person, you can feel like you're telling on yourself because in a way you are, right? Like with anything you write though, that's the secret. Like anything you write ever, you have to be willing to tell on yourself in some way because otherwise you're not actually like going as deep as you could go. And so you have to do that like balancing act between like being willing to tell on yourself and tell on the character in order to tell the truth, and also like taking care of yourself as much as you can.
So interesting. Okay, let's do this quick Q&A, and then there's a couple questions that are going to come up in the chat. Okay, first question is, what are you reading right now?
Actually, I'm reading. So I'm like I'm only like a third of the way through this book, but it's super interesting. I'm reading this book called Sphinx. If people can see this on my screen, but it was a gift from a friend actually. It's for those of you who aren't seeing it. It's called Sphinx, and it's by Anne Gareta, translated from the French by Emma Ramadan, and it's actually what they call an Oulipian novel, which I'd never heard of, but it's basically a novel with a constraint. And in this case, the constraint
Libyan?
Oulipian is
Libyan.
what, at least in the intro, that's what it said. And I was like, what's that? Turns out, so if a novel is considered that kind of novel, it means that it has some kind of textual constraint. And in this case, the constraint is that the gender of the lover of the main character is never actually declared. Like, which in English is easier, right? But it was written in French to not declare the gender of a person at all, like to never gender a person at all in a romance language or just like in Arabic, right? It's like super
Yeah.
hard. So I'm reading this and I'm kind of like fascinated by that.
Hmm.
So anyway,
Cool. Say the name. It's Sphinx by who?
Anne Gareta.
Gareta. Okay, cool. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present? I mean, you kind of did it through your book, but who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Yeah, I mean, aside from the book, I thought about this question a lot actually, and I appreciated the heads up. And the best answer I could come up with, because there's so many people, is probably like my own ancestors. I feel like a lot of my work is kind of a way of haunting the past, like a future haunting. And yeah, I really would love to like be able to go back in time and like connect with ancestors of mine that are no longer living. I feel like, I mean, I try to do that to the extent possible, even in my everyday life.
Mhm.
I know a lot of other people that do too, but it would be fun to be able to do it in a more like literal or physical way.
Cool. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
Yeah, I mean, aside from what we talked about before, I think, I guess I would answer this with like a wish for what people would come to my work with or knowing, which is that I wish that people or that more people would come to my work with an acceptance of, or at least an open mind about, like the multiplicity that's contained within it. Because I think it's, and I get this. Like I think for a lot of people, the way, especially like just the way things are marketed, like it's easy to come to something for like one very specific thing, and the way
Yeah.
that even just publishing works, like things will be marketed as like this or that, or like it's a trans novel, it's an Arab novel, it's a this novel, and it's like it's there's a lot of multiplicity, there's a lot of intersecting um, experiences, let's say, and identities in my work. And I try to like hold all of those things. I mean, I hold them every day in my own body, right? And a lot of us do. So I guess that would be my wish for more people to come to it, being like open to that and knowing
Yeah.
that that's possible.
Yeah. It says like on the cover, it's like a novel. That's what it is. Um, okay. Outside of your profession, whose work inspires you?
Oh gosh. Well, having just done this art show, like I've been really inspired lately by people who are basically anybody who works in a medium other than words, like visual artists, my friends who are filmmakers, who are musicians, like my friend, like I was talking about Randa Jarar, who's now like making film, Donia Jarar, who's my friend who's a musician and like composer, friends of mine that like are photographers or who like play instruments. I mean, I have a friend here that we collaborated with on the a sound installation for the art show, named Carlos Piga, who's a really good friend of mine, who plays the launedas, which is this like traditional Sardinian instrument. He's Sardinian, which is like, think of it like a bagpipe but without the bag, like your cheeks are the bag. And it's just
How
like the
funny.
amount of training that goes into playing this. It's three pipes and you play it with the air in your cheeks and like circular breathing. And I'm like, this is amazing. Like I can't do that. I wish I could, but instead I'll just like cheer you on.
So cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have two questions. The first comes from Ash. Ash, go ahead.
Hi, I'd love to hear more about the characters and how they changed throughout your many drafts. Were there any characters who really surprised you or changed drastically from your initial ideas of them, or who joined the story way later in your drafting of it?
That's a really good question, Ash. So the main protagonist, Nadar, actually, when I wrote the very first draft, I was not out, like even to myself, and so I was like, oh, I'm just gonna write this story about a totally cis person, who was queer in the first draft, but I really I quickly kind of realized. And actually, it's funny because I was at a writing workshop. I was actually at Vona, which is a workshop for writers of color. And someone who's now a very good friend who I met in that workshop told me, it feels like there's a lot of gender stuff going on in this book. And I was kind of like, oh my God, you're right. You're right. I can't hide. It's all there. So speaking of like telling on yourself, I came out shortly thereafter and as trans, and I realized I was like, oh, I've been writing a book about a trans person like this entire time, and so I had to like process that and work on recrafting the story over a couple of years in order to get to the story I was actually trying to tell. So yeah, a lot of change for sure.
Wow. Um, Great. Thanks, Ash. Um, so Tanya asked me to ask her question. What would your advice be to people who are trying to break into fiction writing, the literary space with all the gatekeeping? What were your most impactful experiences that you had early on?
For sure, far and away, it would be connecting with other writers, especially like other marginalized writers, other like writers of color, other queer and trans writers. That was super important for me. If not, like, not necessarily for like the ways that it opens doors, although it can, but more just for the fact of like you feel less alone. And also, like, it reminds you that you're in it together. I mean, I feel like the whole point of a lot of this exercise, so to speak, of publishing is to like, not just to get in the door, but to like put your foot in the door and kick it open, because that's the only way things are going to change. So yeah, like connecting with other people and looking out for each other, and having like other folks reading your work, and being willing to read their work, and just getting like interested in what each other is doing and cheering each other on. None of us are in this alone.
So my last question to you, in case there's anyone else in the chat that has a question, is what advice would you give yourself 10 years ago when you were thinking about whatever you were thinking about at the time? What sort of professional, emotional uh, pro tips have you taken on that person needed to hear?
Oh, well. I feel like we're on like RuPaul's Drag Race where you take out the portrait of the, what would you tell to your like 5-year-old self? No. For anybody that watches.
That's the DNA that I see in my interviews.
You know, maybe there's a lot of things, but maybe one thing would just be that like the things that interest you are not a mistake. That like it's very easy to feel, I mean, publishing is the kind of enterprise where there can be pressure to like write about certain things because they feel more serious, or you want to be taken seriously or whatever. You feel like, oh, but I can't tell that kind of story, or I can't talk about that thing, or I can't go to that place that's really uncomfortable or shameful or whatever. And I think that, you know, I feel like it's really just now that I'm really starting to come into a sense of what I'm really deeply interested in, regardless of whether anybody else finds it interesting or not. I'm like, it's okay. It'll find its audience, right? Because I'm sure that I'm not the only one. But that like being really deeply interested in what you're writing is the key to good writing. Like you can't write about something or force yourself to write about something just because you think you should. You have to write about what you really need to talk about. Yeah. I think
that's amazing advice. I mean, I'm going to steal this clip for afikra workshops, because like we always talk about this idea of being interested over being interesting. And I think there's a pressure to be interesting and to be like, oh, I've chosen topics that are like good cocktail banter, you know, versus picking things that you're actually invested in and that you have a stake in, whether if it's like random birds, like mythical bird-like creatures. Like, okay, you have a stake in it, so like reveal yourself honestly. And maybe people resonate with that, or maybe not, but it's like at least a good use of your time.
Yeah, and you're more interesting when you yourself are interested, you know?
So, yeah, exactly. Well, Zeyn, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for writing the book. And I'm sure there are people out there saying to themselves, oh, you can do this, and so you should feel good about that.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really awesome.
Okay, everybody, this will go up on YouTube tomorrow and up on our podcast tomorrow. Please share it with your friends who may have missed today's talk, and we'll see you on tomorrow.